Okay, hello everyone. My name is Anton. This is Gallery. We're with IBM. We're going to be talking about GDPR, and we were wondering how many people in Texas will come to listen about European data protection policy. Okay, but hey, we got enough people to actually talk about this. Okay, so we got what? We got about 2,000 slides that we're going to go through. We got Q&A session at the end, okay, and feel free to ask us questions at the end. So, we're from IBM, so we need to have some legal disclaimer, obviously, right? Essentially, the point of this disclaimer is to say that GDPR is a legal requirement. It's not a technical requirement, right? Technical, that's how you implement it, that's how you address it, but it's a legal requirement, okay? So everything we're going to be talking about here today, that's not a legal advice. We're going to be talking about how we address it, right, and what works for us, okay? But if you want to address it, and trust me, I'll explain why everyone should be concerned about GDPR, right? You need to get legal advice as well, because as I said, first of all, it's a legal requirement, okay? So that's a rough agenda for today. We'll spend some time, probably less than a minute, talking about what we do to set some context, okay, to explain why GDPR was crucial for what we do, right? And terminology, key issues, and how do we handle GDPR in where we work, what we do, Q&A at the end. Okay, so me and Gallery were working on IBM Cloud Application Identity Service. Essentially, in a nutshell, this is what it does. Okay, you're building applications in cloud, okay, and we don't care which cloud you run on. It's not like IBM Cloud, right? You're building your applications, they run somewhere in cloud. You want to introduce authentication to those applications, okay? So we provide authentication and authorization as a service, okay? That's our bread and butter. If you're familiar with AWS Cognito, Auth0, Azure, what they call it, B2C, Active Directory, right? Those are similar features. Essentially, the idea is developers don't need to learn all the security specifications and how to properly do security, not to be compromised with everything. We provide it as a service, okay? To give a little bit deeper picture of what we do, right? Essentially, no need to focus on every single detail. Any application running anywhere, right? And any identity source or identity provider running anywhere, on cloud, on-prem, doesn't really matter. The service that we work on is essentially connecting applications and identities, okay? So the common way to name it is identity as a service. Three major pillars of what we do, that's our icon on top there, that's us, is authentication, okay? And obviously, if you have authentication, you need to have authorization as well. User management and application user profiles, okay? And I'm emphasizing this because all of this is related to user data, some kind of information about users, emails, social securities, I don't know, photos, whatever, right? It's all user data, and GDPR strictly talking about user data. So this is the reason GDPR was crucial for us to understand for our service, because again, we're a service, okay? We're not doing applications for end users, right? We're IBM, so we're working with companies that build applications for their users. So we're providing authentication as a service to whoever wants to build their application in cloud, okay? So roughly 5 months ago, that's what every single inbox on the planet looked like, okay? Around May 25th, everyone was starting to get emails saying, we're compliant, this service is compliant, we're updating our policies, we're updating our rules, right? If you recall, not so long ago, a lot of emails were flowing the week around May 25th this year, okay, saying we've updated everything. And if you look at the senders, right, so this is Major League Soccer. I'm not really sure what they have to do with Europe, right, because GDPR, that's a European thing. And others like Uber, for example, or many American companies, they were updating their stuff, their policies, data policies as well. Okay, so why exactly everyone had to update? So Spotify, for example, why everyone had to update their policies due to this European guideline, right? So to put it simply, what GDPR is, it's talk about three things: compliance, data protection, and personal data. So first of all, from compliance perspective, GDPR, it's a single regulation to rule them all. It defines the policies of data management, the processes, the organizational changes you need to make in order to be compliant. It also defines what does it mean to be compliant. And the compliance responsibility for being compliant is actually on us, on you, on whoever providing the service. Data protection. So that's, as I said previously, right, GDPR is a legal requirement. It's not a you must encrypt with RSA or whatever technical requirement. It's a legal requirement. You must have data protection, okay? And that's a fancy EU term for data security, encryption, access control, monitoring, reporting, audit, etc., right? So data needs to be protected according to the guide. Personal data. What's very new about GDPR is that it completely redefines what personal data is. And the definition, I have a separate slide defining what personal data is according to GDPR. The definition is much more, well, it significantly differs from previous definitions. So if you're familiar with, there's a US term, PII, right? GDPR is significantly more than that, okay? So we'll get there. So to give some numbers, right, GDPR is a little bit more than 260 pages, okay, 99 chapters, 173 recitals, and 14 key issues that we will talk about today. So it's almost 300 pages of legal requirements, how to treat data, okay? It's a very fun document. Okay, let's go forward. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into what GDPR is. So GDPR is active today. The regulation is actually being used today. It came, technically it was the beginning day of enforcing this regulation in May 25th, okay, earlier this year. So it's about 5 months. The regulation was announced 2 years before that. So companies had about 2 years to actually update their stuff. At the moment, it's not very strictly enforced. It's kind of soft round, trying to understand what's going on, okay? And the reason for that, right? First of all, it has a global impact, okay? Yes, it's a European data protection regulation, but it applies to everyone, okay? And I'll explain in a moment why it does. And the potential penalty for not being compliant is 4% of your annual turnaround or 20 million euros, which is 20-something million dollars, 24, something like that, okay? And the highest, right? They will not take the lowest, the highest. And what's important about this penalty for non-compliance? It's per incident, okay? So no one wants to be there, that's for sure, okay? So a little bit about global impact. Okay, yes, it's a European regulation, okay? But according to that regulation, it applies to any EU data subject. And that's the first term that I would like to define here. What is EU data subject? So according to GDPR, data subject is defined as any human, okay? It's, it has to be a human entity, person, right? That is currently inside of European Union. It's not a citizen of European Union, right? It's not a resident. It's any human being currently in EU. So you traveling to London, well, not sure about London. You're traveling to Paris makes you a EU data subject, okay? So if you're in EU for 2 weeks, and there is a company, American company, collecting your data in that time frame, that data falls under GDPR. Fun, right? So if there is a company in New York promoting travel to US, to Europe, well, to everyone in the world, Europeans being part of that everyone in the world, yes, they fall under GDPR, okay? So every single person in EU at any given moment considered to be a EU data subject. So the definition is very, very strict here. Security of personal data. Okay, essentially, security of personal data talks about how to secure personal data. First of all, it defines what personal data is, and that's my following slide. Okay, and it defines what encryption needs to take place. How do you encrypt your data? How do you ensure that data is secured in transit, right? GDPR doesn't say that you only can keep your data in Europe. No, you can keep your data outside of Europe. But if you want to keep it outside of Europe, you have additional 50 pages of rules how exactly this should be done, how do you transfer that data, etc., etc. So GDPR talks about how to secure your personal data. A huge part of GDPR is consent, okay? So this is something relatively new. And I think the easiest way to summarize it is instead of opt-out, users have to opt-in, okay? So no more pre-checked checkboxes, okay? Users have to opt-in into using a particular feature. Moreover, if you want to share user information with some third party for some processing, users have to explicitly opt in for that. So you need to notify user that I'm planning to share your information with this, I don't know, whatever company, right, for advertising, right, Facebook, Google, right. Users have to explicitly approve that action, okay? So consent is a huge part of GDPR. Accountability of compliance. GDPR defines very clearly that companies that process data, that collect data, that work with data are accountable. Wrong button. Are accountable of being compliant. Okay, so essentially you have to audit everything. Okay, and you have to, those 99 chapters or 100 chapters I was talking about, you have to provide proof that you're compliant. Okay, it's not just self-certification saying, yeah, I'm compliant. No, you actually need to provide a proof that you're compliant with those regulations. And the last part is data protection by design and by default. This is interesting. Essentially, this implies that you need to provide proof that you're taking data privacy into consideration when you're designing your system. Okay, so no more just let's store that data in SQL. Okay, not that easy. Okay, you need to consider, okay, how do I encrypt that data? Where do I keep my encryption keys? Do I keep my encryption keys per customer or per user of that customer? So all of those considerations are relevant under GDPR. Okay, let me just quickly take a look if I forgot something in my notes. Okay, so we're good here. So I'm using a lot of terminology here, and that's terminology dictated by GDPR. So I want to overview this, give like a quick overview of the terminology that's used by GDPR. So first of all, data subject. We talk about that. That's identifiable living natural person, right? That's the official definition. Note that it's identifiable, not identified, identifiable. So any piece of information that can be used ever to identify anyone falls under this. Data controller, okay, so that's a major term in GDPR. It's a legal entity that determines the purpose and means of processing of personal data. So essentially, that's an entity that owns data, okay? So as an example, I will be using our service, App ID, right? So our customers who are using our service for authenticating users, they own data. We do not own their data, okay? We're just doing processing of that data, right? So it's not, so data controller, that's the entity that owns user data, right? And obviously because it's a controller, it decides how to control that data, okay? Data processor, so in our case, that's us, right? That's another legal entity that does processing of that personal data on behalf of the controller. So it's up to controller to define rules, how this data should be processed, okay? Stored, encrypted, deleted, et cetera, and it's up to processors to follow those rules. And I have it on one of my subsequent slides. Essentially, controller is responsible for processor being compliant. Okay, so if processor got a problem, right, controller got a problem automatically as well. So personal data, that's actually my next slide. Any information relating to a data subject, regardless where it is stored. Any information about anyone being physically in EU at any point, doesn't really matter if you store the data in Europe, in Americas, in Asia, it doesn't really matter, okay? So all of that is considered personal data. Processing, that's relatively easy. That's any operation performed on personal data. So that's plain CRUD operations, right? Or updates, or backups, or whatever. Any operation that can be performed. Bank transactions, for example, okay? And the last three are data privacy. Okay, so that's the right of the individual to control how their public and non-public personal data is collected and used. So essentially what it means, your data is your data subject, and your data belongs to you. So you have full control over what's going on with the data. Who this data is shared for, okay? You want GDPR entitles data subject to request a report of what's going on with their data at any given moment. Okay, so you can go to data controller. I don't know, let's take a couple of examples, right? You're a customer of an airline company, right? Without pulling any particular names. Airline company shares your information with some hotel chain, okay? So essentially, well, with multiple hotel chains. Under GDPR, you can go to that airline company and say, okay, I do not want my information to be shared with Hilton. I'm okay with this information being shared with Marriott or Best Western or whatever. Right, so GDPR essentially implies that, yes, users are empowered to fully control their data, including when this data is deleted, when this data is backed up, etc. Right? And you as data controller got, if I recall correctly, it's something like 7 days to produce a report if user asks you to. Okay? It's very harsh rule. So data security. This is more of a technical thing, right? And Gallery will be talking about that in a couple of slides. Essentially, this is the protection of personal data against loss, unauthorized access, destruction, use, modification, disclosure, etc., etc. Speaking technical terms, this is how you encrypt data, this is how you implement your access control, this is how you address your backups, right, all this information. So this is data security. And data governance defines who can take what actions with what personal data, when, under which circumstances, using what methods. So essentially, it's a set of rules, right? This is what you do, this is how you do it, and who's allowed to do that. Okay, we're good so far? Okay, I just got like a couple slides left. Okay, so the definition of personal data. Okay, this is the fun part. Any information relating to identified or identifiable natural person. So you can see this list on your screen, on my screen, right here, right? Basically, it's much more extensive than standard PII. Okay, a good example of that would be IP address. IP address is not part of PII, it is part of personal data. Okay, any identifier, such as just picking random biometric data, data concerning health, or data concerning a natural person's sex life or sexual orientation, any of these is considered personal data, okay? And this data needs to be protected, this data needs to be governed, and essentially everything I had on my previous slide. GDPR does not define what exactly specifically personal data is, it gives guidelines, okay? Essentially, this kind of level, right? So you have personal data, standard things like name, IDs, like social security, location, online identifier, that's your IP address or your, I don't know, Facebook user ID or whatever user ID you're using in any other system. And this, as you can understand, is very closely related to what we do, right? We're doing user management, right? We're all about IDs, right? And information. So with personal data definition being this broad, right, we definitely had to rethink how do we treat data. So it's not as simple as, well, we'll just use database in somewhere in Germany, right? Because it's on Europe soil, right? It's right there, and we're good. No, it is much more significant than that. Gillery will have. So two of my last slides. To summarize the overall definition of GDPR. It's a good thing. It's not a pretty thing, right? But for users, it's actually not a bad thing, right? You've all heard of data breaches, and you know, I'm probably getting at least 10 calls a day, and my iPhone saying scam likely, right? You're probably getting that as well, right? GDPR prevents abuse of data. GDPR is one regulation to rule them all, meaning there were a lot of different rules and regulations before GDPR. The idea of GDPR is to kind of centralize everything and make sure there is one rule to follow. Even that rule is very broad, okay? All the previous regulations were created before the age of Instagram and mobile phones and etc. So GDPR addresses that very precisely, right? GDPR gives a somewhat precise definition to personal data. Okay, so yes, it will use things like your name and your ID number, right? But it will also define more abstract terms of what might be considered personal data. Okay, and GDPR enhances or extends rights of individuals located in EU, right? So as an individual, you have a right to get information, what's going on with your data, to access data, right? To rectify, erase, object, etc. Give or withdraw data specific content. So as I said, you can decide that data controller should not be sending your data to a particular data processor. Okay, so it's your decision. You do not want your data to be shared with, particular content. Okay, inside is automatic decision making, transfer personal data to other providers. So the last one is interesting. Essentially, originally everyone thought that GDPR means your data has to be physically in Europe, right? And it only affects those who store data in Europe. No, it is not. Your data can be anywhere. Okay, but if that data was collected about a person, right, data subject, while that data subject was in Europe, right, you need to follow GDPR for that data. Okay, so originally, right, we thought, hey, we'll just implement it. Gillery will talk about our service runs in multiple regions across the globe, right, and we thought, hey, just implement it in Europe, right, and others are not. No, that's not the case. We had to implement it across the board, right, for every single region. Okay, so we're GDPR compliant in Sydney and in Washington, even though it's not Europe, right? Why? Because there might be European customers, right, who are using our service in Sydney. They might be Australian companies who are providing services to Europeans, okay? And all of that falls under GDPR. So GDPR has a huge organizational impact, right? Literally, we're IBM, right? We had an army of lawyers looking at this and providing guidance, okay? And this hugely affected pretty much every part of what we do, okay? So it took, I don't know, it took us probably something like 4 to 5 months to actually stay calm, right, regarding GDPR, saying, okay, no one's gonna give us 20 million euro fine, okay? So organizational impact is huge. First of all, controllers and processors are liable for breaches. There is a rule in GDPR saying any data breach that you have to make a public announcement within 72 hours, okay? 72 hours is not even enough to understand that you actually had a data breach, okay? 3 days, come on, right? You don't have enough time to properly react to that, but you have to make a public announcement, okay? The data was breached, and then you can continue evolving that announcement. Controllers are legally bound to validate processor's compliance, right? So if you're, as a controller, you decide to share data with a new processor, it's up to you. You're responsible for validating that processor is compliant. DPOs, data protection officers, are now mandatory, right? So they're mandatory for companies above 250 employees. But if you're such a company, you need to assign a data protection officer, professional, and there are a set of requirements for that professional that will be responsible for data protection in your company. Security, data security, breach management, talked about this. Processor is jointly responsible for cross-border data transfer. So if you're in Europe, but you're sharing data with a processor in a different country, like in a different continent, right? It's your shared responsibility to ensure that GDPR is followed. Documented audible. So we're going to be talking about audits in a moment. Increased cost of non-compliance. I think 4% or 20 million euros. It's kind of self-explanatory. No one wants to be there. So as of today, I haven't heard of anyone being fined, or no one got that fine, right? Because they still run in like a soft run mode, right? Checking that everyone is compliant. But it will be great to see, well, it wouldn't be great to see someone fined, but I do expect to see the first occurrence of this fine happening to understand how exactly a company got there, okay? Not often. Okay, data privacy authorities empowered, et cetera, et cetera. So the last piece here is GDPR applies to controllers and processors located in EEA, so that's Economic European Area. It also applies to controllers and processors located outside of EEA, if they are processing personal data, and you remember, personal data, that's practically anything, in relation to the offering of goods and services to individuals located in EEA. Not Europeans, individuals located in EEA. So if I travel to Europe today, right, I become one of these, right, individuals located in EEA, or for purpose of monitoring their behavior. So that's why, roughly 5 months ago, right, all the companies, most of the companies, right, started sending those notices, right, because basically saying, hey, we're compliant. So, because that's the first part in GDPR, making sure you are compliant, and then notifying, right, everyone saying, we're compliant, okay? And if you need some proof, we got a proof, right? I cannot say for everyone, but we do have proof. So let's go to a little bit more technical piece, right? How we actually got there. We're good on time? Oh yeah, we're good on time. Okay. So I was talking about theory. Now let's talk about how we actually got there from a technical standpoint. So those are 14 key issues as defined in GDPR. Okay, we've talked about consent, DPOs. I haven't talked about email marketing because we're not doing that, right? That's completely irrelevant for us. Encryption, fines, personal data, privacy by design, right? So we picked a few, right? We picked 6 out of 14, which are very relevant to what we do. Okay, and we decided to elaborate a little bit about how exactly we achieve that in our service. So, Gallery, we'll talk about that.
I think I'm going to use this. Can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, so as Anton mentioned that, so App ID is being deployed in multiple geographical regions, right? So we have Dallas, Washington, London, Frankfurt, Sydney, and more coming up. But the point is that not only is GDPR compliant, it applies to us because we're actually in Frankfurt, but also because the data subjects that we hold their information are going to be in Europe. So we live in a very fluid world, and everyone's using cloud services, and so we need everywhere. Dallas, Washington, Sydney, they all need to be compliant with GDPR. So the first question really is, so once we've answered the question of whether or not we need to actually be compliant, we need to ask the question of, so what are we? Are we a data processor or a data controller? And this is kind of tricky because in a way we actually have, so as Anton mentioned, so we are a authentication company, we are, authentication service, we federate identity information, we actually store profile information for the user. So we collect information, right? And so all of these, so we store and process information, but the way we do it is that we say, you, the consumer, the customer, the app developer, are the owners, and we provide REST APIs for everything that we do, right? So we have, for all the data that we own, that we store, we provide APIs that allow the user, the customer, to actually control. And so they can do CRUD operations on them, they can delete them at their will. And so the way we've set up AppID is that we are a data processor and the customer is the data controller. And that's really important in the way that GDPR applies to us. So, okay, so the next step is, now that we say, okay, so we're a data processor, so what kind of personal data do we actually store? And as Anton mentioned, so there are lots of different types of personal data, right? So we have not only the identity of the user, the authentication information, passwords, etc., that we store, but also their social network. How are they using our service? What kind of configuration? How is the way that they're using our service? How have they configured our system? Then the question becomes, what's the retention time? So are we actually storing information longer than is necessary? Do we get rid of it? Is there a TTL for that information that we're storing? What about data protection? And this data protection doesn't just mean data in transit. And when I say data in transit, I'm not talking about when we have data that's flowing from the web application, for example, let's say, or your application to the service, but even within the service, within the microservices that are being hosted, right? And what about the modules outside? What about the database? Is the data that's being passed around in transit, is it all secure? Is it secure at a communication level, or is it secure at a field level? So that needs to be considered. And then what about data at rest? So are we storing it? Are we storing the data in our databases? Or do we secure it at a disk level? What about caching? What about backups? So what about all the different copies of data that we store in order to make things easier for us? And then there's data deletion. And data deletion, that's a key part of the whole idea of the right to be forgotten. If someone doesn't want certain information to be kept, then they have the right to say, delete that data, right? I'm the owner of that data, I want it to be deleted. And so this is kind of tricky because there are different definitions of deletion. So for example, NIST says that the way they define destruction, actually, data destruction, is that it's not enough that you delete the handler to a piece of data, right? So what you actually need to do is you need to go to the piece of memory and you need to write, and at a bit level, we need to overwrite that piece of memory at least 3 times, right? That's how you make sure that you don't get the data back. So that's data destruction. Fortunately, GDPR doesn't say data destruction. They're talking about data deletion. But again, when they talk about data deletion, they're talking about backups. They're talking about copies. So you need to consider all of that. So let's give an example on our side. So we definitely have user authentication information. We have account details. We have custom attributes, and these custom attributes are, for example, if you have an application and you want to get, let's use the example of a airline company, for example, and they want to keep, I don't know, let's say that's United, and they have mileage plus number, right? Let's say they want to have mileage plus number of their users. So that's some kind of custom attribute that they can keep. So we have all kinds of data, right? But again, the point is that this data is controlled and owned by either the customer or the data subject. Then what we say is retention time is really customer decision. So it's what, again, based on the APIs that we provide, we say you tell us when you want to delete it, and we won't keep it after that. Data protection, we'll talk about the field level encryption in a sec, and it's It's kind of cool. And then the data deletion part, the way we have it is that, again, we have data delete APIs, but then we have it, what we do is that we have cryptographic destruction as well. And by that, what I mean is that if you delete a key, for example, the idea is that, and if your encryption scheme, for example, is semantically secure, then you're not going to be able to get the data back, right? Okay, so data protection at rest. So this is kind of one of the most important parts of the way we keep, the way we've actually protected the data that we have. And the thing is, so we have customer data, we have user data, the most important parts of, parts of any any service. But so what we need to do is make sure we need to have isolation, and we need to make sure that we have proper protection along the way. And so what we do is we take advantage of a pattern called a key hierarchy. And what a key hierarchy basically is that you have a tree of keys, right? So you have one key here, and you have keys along the nodes of each of the tree as you come down. And the idea is that each parent key ends up encrypting the child key. So for example, you have the root key over there, and the root key has two child keys. It has per tenant key root key 1 and per tenant key root key 2, right? And that root key encrypts the per tenant key root key and the two. And each of those per tenant root keys, they encrypt their own children, right? And so the idea is that if you actually, so actually there are lots of, so this simple pattern actually incorporates a lot of really neat security ideas. As an example, let's say so that per tenant root key 1, I should have put actually identifiers on them, but let's say the top one, the tenant root key 1. So let's say that gets leaked. So what ends up happening? The way that the tree is set up, if that key gets leaked, then only the subtree underneath it gets compromised, right? Because that's the only thing that you have access to. And so you've managed to isolate your area of your attack surface, essentially, right? The other kind of cool thing is that you're kind of building in the idea of the principle of least privilege. Because you're saying, if you really only need to have access to this kind of information, that's all I'm going to give you. You don't need to have access. So for example, you have the data encryption key, and you have the token signature key. There's no reason for you to have, if you have the data encryption key, there's no reason for you to have the token signature key, right? So we've kind of divided up the different keys based on the roles of the users, or based on the roles of the actions that we're trying to do. So then we also have the fact that you kind of build a root of trust, right? So now we say, okay, so your root key can be, we have to really make sure that we have a really strong root of trust. So we say our root key is going to be stored and protected in an HSM. HSM is a hardware security module, right? And what's really cool about HSMs are they're physical devices. There's physical protection, logical protection of actual pieces of information. So they're all kinds of tamper stars. They're tamper resistant. They're tamper responsive, meaning that if they detect that there's something going on, they might, based on the policy that they have, they might delete the information that they have inside them. They're tamper, what are the other ones? Well, for example, if they see that someone's tampering them, they can go and alert someone, or they can go and, So they're very, very responsive and very, very protective pieces of hardware. So, but the idea is that they're also kind of isolated, and they're slower, and so you might want to have fast decryption or fast encryption, and so if you have a separate physical device, then you're not going to be able to do that. So again, by having this logical partitioning of your keys, what you end up doing is that you give only pertinent information to that HSM. You let that piece of hardware do its magic, and that root key never actually leaves the HSM. So you don't say, hey, HSM, give me your key while I decrypt pertinent key, root key 1. You actually say, hey, HSM, here's my ciphertext, or here's my encrypted data, give me the plain text of that data, right? So the root key never actually leaves that device. Okay, so, and there are also a bunch of other really cool things, like if you want to roll over your keys. right? In that case, you don't actually have to go back and delete, you don't have to roll over a bunch of different things. You can go back, go to that particular key that you want to roll over, change it, and then you can go and, again, encrypt it using its parent key. So all of this, meaning what happens? So now let's say a particular tenant, let's say a particular tenant decides that they want their information to be deleted, right? And so now what we do is that if we delete this particular tenant key, then it goes and, again, because we're using a secure encryption scheme, what ends up happening is that the data encryption key that we had, that's a ciphertext essentially, is going to be indecipherable or indistinguishable from random text. So basically it becomes useless for us. And then the information in our database that's actually specific to that tenant also becomes indecipherable for us from random text. And so what we've done is we've done cryptographic destruction of our data based on tenants, right? So we can do the same thing. So this whole thing is called cryptographic data isolation. And we can do similar things at a more granular level or at a higher level, depending on what we actually want to do. Okay, so great. So we've talked about data protection, and we've kind of touched on data deletion. But what's really important now is this idea of copies. So it's not like we actually have one piece of, one copy of your, your custom info, your authentication information, and we store it in this database, and no one else, once you tell us you want to delete it, we delete it. That's not the way it works, right? So in order for us to have a highly available system, in order to have a resilient system, every service needs to do is they need to have an infrastructure, which, for example, in our case, we are multi-region, right? In each region, we are highly available. It means that we have 3 data centers in each region. In each of these data centers, we basically have containerized microservices that are running on Kubernetes, right? And each of these clusters that we have, they have at least 3 worker nodes and so forth. And you can imagine, and then in each of the, and then for each region, we also have their own Redis databases, and we have cloud NoSQL databases and so forth, right? Point is, you can imagine that at every stage, first of all, we have a lot of data that's actually being transmitted from service to service, from node to node, but also we have a lot of data that's being cached and that's being stored, right? So how do we actually make sure that this data is being kept protected first? And then how do we make sure that this data is deleted when we want it to be deleted? Or it's updated the way we want it, the way it's supposed to be? And so we have to make sure that it is done. So for the stuff that we actually, I'll include that, but essentially for the places that we have control over, right? So we make sure that this is being done, right? And then for the services that we are using, so for example, we're using Cloudant, which, so what we're doing in Cloudant, for example, is we have a service level, and when we get that particular service, we make sure that we have disk level encryption, right, for the databases that we have from them. But then we also make sure that we have service level encryption. That means that we encrypt the data that we actually store over there. So even if there's someone on Cloudant that somehow they have an insider job, and they somehow really want to have access to our data, and they go and look at it, they still can't, because the data that we're storing there is encrypted. And then backups. So the way that we actually handle backups is that we recycle backups. So we make sure that every 14 days we recycle our backups, and we make sure that it reflects whatever's actually the data that we have available. Now, what's important here again is that for us legally, that's an okay thing to recycle, every 14 days. It's not the case in for every use case. So as Anton said, it's a very legal thing outside of, my pay grade. But yeah, so and then the important thing is that we have all these APIs that we really give to the users, and we empower them, but also it makes it easier for us to make sure that that the customers have full control over their own data. Okay, so in addition to that, what's really important is this idea of access tracking, making sure that users know or customers know when their data is being accessed, right? And so this is hard. This is really important from an identity point of view when we talk about the authentication. And so, for example, every time you authenticate, every time your attributes change, every time your profile is updated or deleted or whatever, right? So we have event notifications, and we're using one of the services that IBM Cloud offers, activity tracker. And so users can come and basically have a look and see, oops, they come and have a look and see, they can see, when events happen, what actually got, what the results were, the times, and so forth. And so that's, yeah.
I'll just add here, this is a conceptual slide, right, just showing a specific use case, but you need to track more than that, right? You need to track whenever the configuration was changed, right? Whenever a particular, so this is authentication, as I said, this is conceptual because we're authentication service. What about users being added, updated, deleted, authenticated through a particular provider, right? Changing configuration. So all of that also needs to be tracked, okay? And for that, we're using the access tracking or activity tracking. And as a customer, right, you can export all the data, store it in your archives, take it to some audit processing company, or whatever, right? So we'll give you data, and you can do with that data what you want.
Yeah, and then just to really drive the point home, and I know I've mentioned it before, but it's really important to mention is that we've put the management part of, at least for us, what makes sense is that we don't want to own the data. We've put the management part of the data onto the owners. It's a responsibility of the customer. It's a responsibility of the user, right? And we do this via endpoints. We do this on consoles and so forth. And the point is that we process it, we store it, but we don't own it, and we don't do anything with it. And that's really, I think, one of the key parts of GDPR, that the ownership part is super important. I think it's risky, and so as you're developing applications, as you're developing services, you want to make sure that you have proper, I guess, gateway to your data. I don't know how else to say it, but so that the control is always given to the end user. I think that's it for on my side.
So the end user can decide what should be done with the data. A controller, customer of ours, right, needs to make this decision happen, and we provide tools for a controller to actually make this happen. Okay, so that's the change. And if you have any questions.
Yeah, we'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Absolutely.
So, on your backups, so like when we have to restore something for a particular day, we can go back, step in here and go back. If someone, and I assume you guys have backups, and I assume you guys are storing in backups for historical purposes or whatever. If someone wants to be removed, but let's multiply this by 10,000 people at one time, saying I want to be removed. Does the company have to get each of those staged for when they first existed and start building each one of these?
So we're only storing backups for 14 days.
Yeah.
We're not storing them beyond that. Okay, so we're storing backups in order to restore the service in case of data loss, regional failure, right? So we have enough data, so we'll be able to restore the service to the last working point, okay? But we do not keep data beyond that.
And again, it becomes a responsibility. If the customer wants their data to be kept, to be stored longer, then you can export your data and store it however way you want.
We have those APIs. You, as a customer of ours, as controller, you can export the data at any point and store back. Export the data daily and store it anywhere you want. Okay, but we are not storing our backups beyond 14 days.
Yes, so you mentioned that, and I have two questions, whenever I can ask
There's
them.
two of us.
Perfect.
I'll take the easy one.
Okay, I don't know if one's easier than the other. You mentioned that based on the size of the organization, you must assign a DPO. I understand the DPO must report to executive leadership, which some companies have restructured to make that happen. Are you aware of what that size requirement is? The only thing I've seen is if they require regular and systematic processing of data subjects on a large scale. Is org size more, or is it the size of the data?
That's a good question I do not have answer for, but I can give you a link where to find this information.
Okay.
Right, because DPO piece is described very well in the docs. Right, we have a link down here, and there's a section there talking specifically about DPOs.
About the size of the organization when the DPO flag is.
So the way I think we've implemented this, yes, we have a DPO on a higher level, right? And then for each, we'll call ourselves tribes, right? So we're part of Cloud Security Tribe. Okay, we have a security focal for our tribe, and we have a bunch of other tribes. And that person is actually responsible for bringing all the practices and processes into the tribe, making sure we're compliant. So compliance is not just GDPR, HIPAA, SOC, whatever. We have a dedicated person whose sole responsibility is making sure all of our stuff is compliant. And this is not the person that no one ever heard of. No, this is the person heavily involved on most stages of design, probably besides UI.
And with the enterprise size organizations, it's really clear, their guidance is clear. My question is more for the medium-sized business, when they transition from somebody that's maybe responsible for security risk, compliance, and privacy, to someone that's privacy only.
Yep. That's the reason I don't have answer to your question. I'm coming from IBM.
Right.
But yes, I'll show you where to find this information.
Perfect. Second question. So I understand in GDPR, there may or may not, my understanding is there's a requirement that the data that you share with the customers be in a popular format, so it's easy for them to digest. And so my question is, and I've seen other organizations like Facebook provide you an easy-to-use medium over which to get it, namely in the same web console interface that you navigate through the app. In your settings, you can download your data. So my question for you is, you mentioned multiple times you set up an API for customers to gain access to information.
Yes.
And is that a sufficiently easily accessible medium over which they would access it?
So we're providing UI as well. Okay, we do have UI. We have AppID dashboard. Not everything we have over API is provided in UI. Okay, so we're following, in general, API first approach, and then to make things simpler, we're providing dashboards, UI dashboards as well. Okay, so API just gives you more.
Yeah, but another point to your question is that I think that a lot of times these easy to digest terms of agreement are from the data controllers,
right?
As opposed to the processors,
right?
And so essentially, when we say we provide you with APIs, so now the data controllers have to actually take those APIs, build whatever terms of agreements they want, right? Make them in the format that's agreeable, that's easily digestible, and then provide it to the end user. So I think in this instance, I think that we do provide a dashboard. But again, I think what you're asking might be more of a data controller kind of question.
Yeah.
Oh, because you guys are considered data processors.
Yes, we're more of a data processor.
Exactly.
Okay. So in most cases, the way I like to put it, end users who are authenticating through our service, they don't even have any idea they're using our service or IBM Cloud or whatever. Okay. Right? So we're internal thing. We're making developers' life easier. Right, okay. And developer can make users' life easier.
Right, I'm better understanding the project and how you guys are part of it.
Yeah.
So, thank you.
Any other questions?
Sure.
In the research you did, you have identified the hidden money in the fund?
No. No. I'm not paying that, so I don't care. No.
Good question.
That's a good question. Okay, that's a bedtime reading.
Some kind of lottery.
Yeah.
Any other last questions?
Is there a standard for the privacy impact assessment? Sort of on 14 items that you use? Is there privacy impact assessment like a standard form that's shared across as a global? As a global shared, is that something that's
so We did have one in our company built by our people, right? I'm not familiar with any global standard form that you can fill, right? The way I recall we addressed it is we actually read that 260-page document and created an enormous spreadsheet, right? Which every single service had to fill, right? Standard compliance. Right? I'm not familiar with any standardized tool. Well, I'm assuming there are some startups who are doing that, right? It's a great way to make money, GDPR, right? But I'm not familiar with anything specific.
No other questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot.